Proliferate is a mechanic that was originally introduced in 2010's Scars of Mirrodin. If a card has Proliferate, that means you can choose as many permanents or players with counters on them as you want, and then put one more counter of each kind that was already there. This makes Proliferate very flexible, as it lets you choose your own stuff and or your opponent's, and it works with all kinds of counters regardless of whether they have positive or negative effects. Since 2010, the mechanic has returned numerous times, most recently in Modern Horizons 3. In all, there are 84 cards in Magic with Proliferate, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Bloated Contaminator. For 2 generic and a green, it's a 4/4 with Trample and Toxic 1, which means when it does combat damage to a player, they get a poison counter, and when the Contaminator deals combat damage to a player, you proliferate. Many cards with Proliferate synergize with themselves, and this is an example of that. Because the Contaminator puts a poison counter on your opponent, you'll be using Proliferate to choose your opponent most often. This effectively means the Contaminator puts 2 poison counters on the opponent every time it hits them. The Contaminator has gained all of its points in Toxic decks in Standard, which are of course geared entirely around finishing the opponent off with poison, and the Contaminator certainly helps accelerate that. It's likely to continue to gain points in the future. At number 9, it's Plane-Wide Celebration. For 5 generic and 2 green, this sorcery gives you 4 options, and you can choose the same option more than once. Those options are, make a 2/2 citizen, return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand, gain 4 life, and of course, proliferate. The celebration's flexibility is pretty sweet, as depending on what's going on in the game, you might really want to make a bunch of bodies and or gain life. The other 2 modes are certainly more situational, but depending on your board state, proliferating 4 times might also be pretty insane, like when it unlocks a Planeswalker's ultimate several turns early. It gained all of its points in Standard between 2019 and 2020 when it was featured in Fires of Invention and Adventure decks. More often than not, it was a sideboard card, but not the kind you actually sided in. Both of these decks used wish boards and could grab cards out of the sideboard using Fae of Wishes, and the Celebration was a nice card to wish for because it was useful in so many different situations. It hasn't gained any points since 2020. At number 8, it's Vraska Betrayal's Sting. For 4 generic and a black Phyrexian mana, she's a 6 loyalty planeswalker with completed. This means you can choose to pay 2 life or a black for her 1 Phyrexian mana symbol, and if you choose to pay life, she enters with 2 fewer loyalty. In other words, you can choose to cast her on 5 as a 4 loyalty planeswalker. She has a 0 ability that gets her on this list because she draws you a card, you lose 1 life, and you proliferate. While her ability doesn't say her loyalty goes up, it effectively does, thanks to Proliferate. She's also got a -2 that turns a creature into treasure, and a -9 that says, if target player has fewer than 9 poison counters, they get a number of poison counters equal to the difference. Combined with the Proliferate from her 0 ability on the next turn, Vraska can poison the opponent out all on her own. She's been played in a variety of black control decks in Standard, not too surprising for a planeswalker with a loyalty ability that draws cards and another that removes creatures. While these decks tend to differ in a variety of ways, they do all have one thing in common: lots of cards that care about counters, including fellow planeswalkers like Liliana of the Veil and sagas like the Cruelty of Gix. Being able to proliferate those is a big deal, as Liliana has a game-breaking ultimate, and accelerating through Cruelty of Gix's powerful chapters is a big deal too. Vraska looks well positioned to continue to see play in black control decks in Standard. Her suite of abilities are just great there, and she has plenty of counters to play with. At number 7, it's Volt Charge. It has the same total score as Vraska, but more first tier top 8, so I gave it the higher spot on the list. For 2 generic and a red, it's an instant that does 3 damage to any target, and then you proliferate. 3 mana to do 3 to any target at instant speed is a borderline playable in block and Standard most of the time, so it's not surprising that tacking on Proliferate made for a solid card for those formats. It was played in aggressive red decks in both block and Standard. These decks were packing Stromkirk Noble, Shrine of Burning Rage, and Koth of the Hammer, So having Proliferate tacked onto your burn spells was a big deal, as it meant those cards were usually capable of inflicting even more damage than they could before. At number 6, it's Contagion Clasp. For 2 generic mana, this artifact enters the battlefield and gives a creature a -1/-1 counter, and you can pay 4 generic and tap it to proliferate. Obviously enough, this means you can give that creature more -1/-1 counters, but the Clasp is generally played in decks that can generate more value than that when you activate its ability. It saw play in 2 types of decks while it was in Standard. One of these was Infect, where it could help you poison out your opponent more quickly, and the other was Tezzeret Control, an artifact-focused control deck that ran a bunch of planeswalkers, including Tezzeret Agent of Bolas. In that deck, being an artifact was a big bonus, as was the fact that it could up the loyalty on your planeswalkers rather quickly. It's another card that hasn't done anything since rotating out of Standard. At number 5, it's Serum Snare. For 1 generic and a blue, this instant bounces a non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and if that permanent had a mana value of 3 or less, you proliferate. Kind of like with Volt Charge, 2 mana spells that bounce non-lands tend to be borderline playable in Standard, so proliferate is a nice bonus. Most of its points have come in Standard Toxic decks, where bouncing a blocker out of the way with this and proliferating before hitting the opponent with your toxic creatures is a pretty brutal play. It's still in Standard right now, and Bant Toxic decks are still a thing, so it's likely to gain more points in the future. At number 4, it's Experimental Augury. For 1 generic and a blue, this instant lets you look at your top 3, put a card into your hand, and the rest on the bottom in any order. And then you proliferate. So this one is Anticipate plus Proliferate. While it's gained points in Standard Toxic decks too, it doesn't always appear there. After all, it isn't a particularly aggressive card. It also sees play in Standard Control decks using Planeswalkers, and in Pauper Poison Storm decks. Pauper is a format where only commons are legal, and Poison Storm decks look to get a poison counter on the opponent, and then gradually add more counters using Proliferate. Grabbing another card that gets you a poison counter when you cast Augury feels pretty good. Additionally, the deck uses Everflowing Chalice and Pentad Prism for mana, and the Augury can make those mana rocks even more potent while adding poison to the opponent. The Augury looks well positioned to continue to gain points in both Standard and Pauper. At number 3, it's Tezzeret's Gambit. For 3 generic mana and 1 blue Phyrexian mana, it's a sorcery that draws you 2 cards and then you proliferate. If you pay 2 life instead of blue mana, you're getting a pretty great deal here, as it's an easier to cast Divination with Proliferate stapled to it. While in Standard, it was played alongside Contagion Clasp and Tezzeret decks, but it was also played in decks that didn't even run blue because it gave them access to card advantage. For example, it was played in the same mono-red decks that Volt Charge was played in. It's also found success in Legacy Infect. These decks run tons of super cheap spells to buff their Infect creatures, like Glistener Elf, and drawing a couple of cards with Tezzeret's Gambit was a good way to up your opponent's poison count while finding more pump spells to give the opponent 10 poison counters. However, the Gambit hasn't top-8'd anything since 2019. At number 2, it's Throne of Geth. For 2 generic mana, this artifact taps and sacrifices an artifact to proliferate. Not having to spend any mana to proliferate is pretty awesome, and it can even give itself up to do it in a pinch. Unlike every card we've seen on the list so far, Throne of Geth didn't see any play in Standard. And indeed, for a long time it wasn't really played anywhere. There just weren't counter-based decks around that also had expendable artifacts. However, this all changed in 2018, when it suddenly started to see play in Legacy Death's Shadow. These decks didn't have any cards that cared about counters, so what exactly is going on here? Well, Death's Shadow decks are loaded up with cards that cost 1 mana. This means a Chalice of the Void with a single charge counter frequently locks them out of the game entirely. So the main game plan at combating this weakness? Use Throne of Geth to proliferate and add a charge counter to the Chalice, at which point you're good to go. This is the kind of thing that makes Proliferate so interesting. You can use it to give yourself more counters or poison out your opponent more quickly, but you can also use it to hate on cards that are dependent on counters, like Chalice of the Void. It also started to see play in Modern in 2018, albeit for different reasons. While Chalice of the Void is also a factor in that format, and sometimes you can use the Throne to tamper with it, the Modern decks that use Throne of Geth are actually counter decks. In particular, they are Hardened Scales decks. In Modern, these are artifact-centric decks that run the powerful +1/+1 counter artifact creature trio of Arcbound Ravager, Hangerback Walker, and Walking Ballista. These 3 creatures love their counters and can do a whole lot more with them than just get massive. The Ravager can put its counters somewhere else, the Walker makes a bunch of Thopters, and the Ballista can wipe the board or one-shot the opponent with all its counters. So having an artifact sacrifice outlet that also adds counters to your creatures makes perfect sense in Hardened Scales. While the throne is still seeing play in modern Hardened Scales decks right now, it's doing so at a much lower rate than it used to. This is because it's largely been replaced by Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which allows you to put counters on things and give them abilities of creatures it exiles, allowing for even sillier things to happen with the abilities of the Ravager, Walker, and Ballista. So Throne of Gath may actually be done putting up significant top 8s, but we can't count it out entirely just yet. And at number 1, probably not surprising anyone, it's Yawgmoth Thran Physician. For 2 generic and 2 black, he's a 2/4 protection from humans. You can also pay 1 life and sacrifice another creature to put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature and draw a card. And his last ability is the one that gets him on this list. You can pay 2 black, discard a card, and proliferate. Yawgmoth is inherently powerful. His first activated ability costs no mana and can generate cards and remove creatures, and his ability to proliferate makes those counters far more potent. Yawgmoth is from Modern Horizons, and that means the only paper 60-card formats he's ever been legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. It's a good thing too, because he's not only insanely powerful in a vacuum, he's also very easy to combo off with. This has been especially true in Modern, where he's played in decks that are named for him. These are toolbox decks that run tons of ways to tutor up creatures, like Court of Calling and Eldritch Evolution. The deck can win in a traditional way that creature decks do, but it also has several combo wins. Many of these involve Yawgmoth and creatures with Undying. When a creature with Undying dies, it comes back to the battlefield from the graveyard with a +1/+1 counter on it. If you use Yawgmoth's ability to put a -1/-1 counter on that creature, the 2 counters cancel each other out. This means you can just keep sacrificing Undying creatures over and over again thanks to Yawgmoth's ability. Throw something like Zulaport Cutthroat in the mix and you have a combo that drains all of your opponent's life. So, how does Proliferate come up in that deck? Well, while it isn't central to the deck's main game plan, Proliferate does do stuff from time to time. Yawgmoth's ability is sometimes needed before you can combo off, in which case you're usually putting the counters on your opponent's creatures, and Proliferate can allow you to take down even more of them. Proliferate can also be used, of course, to interfere with Chalice of the Void, as discussed earlier, as well as Aether Vial, and Yawgmoth decks also play Grist the Hunger Tide, and upping his loyalty is never a bad thing. In short, Proliferate is some really nice additional utility to have on an already very powerful card. Yawgmoth is still seeing a ton of play in Modern, and that's not changing anytime soon, so I imagine he will remain the number 1 Proliferate card in Magic for the foreseeable future. So, those are the best Magic cards with Proliferate. Do you want to proliferate? If so, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in this video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on more than 730 other MTG top 10s, including many more that look at keyword abilities and mechanics, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.